everything going on, spring break, people haven't worked a full day of work. We have nearly 200 people who have dialed in to be a part of this important conversation. And that is so touching. That is so gratifying. Thank you so much for being here and welcome. We promise we are going to make good use of your very limited time and your expertise. My name is Abby Tinsley. I am a proud member of National Wildlife Federation, have been a staff member here for 6 years and worked on Capitol Hill for about 10 years before that. So I have seen a lot of things and experienced a lot of things in the political climate, but truly nothing quite like this. And I imagine you might be kind of feeling and seeing the same, which might be exactly why you're here. We're really facing an extraordinarily difficult political moment for a lot of the things that we care about. And unfortunately, it couldn't come at a more perilous moment for wildlife and vulnerable communities. But we are just, again, so grateful that you are here with us. We had nearly 1,200 folks, I think, originally register for this, which just shows how many people are paying attention to what's going on and how many people are looking to take action. And we will have lots of advice for you and suggestions about how you can do exactly that. But really just thank you. We wouldn't be anywhere without you. Your support has just had such a proven track record of success for the issues that we all care about together. Last year, we accomplished a ton of things in a different political environment, admittedly, but really proved that conservation and wildlife and love for our public lands and commitment to addressing the climate crisis unites us all. And we can get good things done when we work together, when we're willing to cross the aisle, and when we ground everything in sound science, which is going to be our first speaker that you'll hear from today. We do have an absolutely exceptional lineup for you. It was pretty hard to pick what we could spotlight because, as I mentioned, there's just so very much going on from attacks on the climate investments that we worked so hard to pass last Congress, to the courts undoing rulemakings around clean water, and just the never-ending attacks on wildlife that we care about and that we love. So I know a lot of you have been around the block, as it were, and working with us on these important issues. So I'm actually curious if you've got a poll feature available. What we'd love to get a sense of is if you have ever spoken to your member of Congress in person or called their office. So a lot of folks might have sent an email here or there, but we're really curious how many of you have really engaged directly with your member of Congress, and that'll help us suit this presentation for you. So fill that out when you get a chance, and my colleague will let me know when we should announce the results. While you're working on that, I'll tell you that when I was a staffer in the Senate, one of my first jobs was to catalog and develop responses for all of those letters that we received from members of Congress. And I worked for a Florida member, so we had a big old population in our state of folks weighing in. And it is just so incredible how one email, one letter, especially a bigger campaign like the ones we work on, really turn into a conversation with the senator. That turns into the sponsorship for a bill. That turns into them saying, I want to do an activity and a roundtable and I have a conversation about this issue next time I'm back in state. So no matter how you've engaged with your member of Congress, I also, my very first job was answering the phones in that front office. So I promise no matter how you engage, people take note of it and staffers work on that, and that turns into real activity. So no shade if you haven't done one of those things yet. We'll make sure you feel very well equipped to by the end of this presentation. All right. Looks like a ton of folks have already had the experience of approaching their member of Congress or calling their office and talking to their staff about an issue that's important to them. That is so wonderful, and not surprised at all to see that. That is just such a testament to your commitment to these issues. And hopefully, we're equipping you with the things that that you want to talk about. What you'll hear a lot about in this particular event tonight is focused on a couple of key areas: science, climate and energy, and wildlife refuges in particular, as well as a focal point on state wildlife action plans, which is a really great opportunity to engage on these issues at a state and local level too, and not just kind of approaching your federal members of Congress. So we have some brilliant speakers that you'll hear from, and then we'll have time for a question and answer. And after that, definitely stay on, because you'll hear more about how to take action around a lot of these issues, which is definitely what we want to make sure you feel ready and prepared to do. Before I turn it over to our first speaker, I did just want to make sure I share with you a resource that is fresh off the printers. Just this week, we have released the National Policy Agenda for the 119th Congress, which is a document that we work on at the beginning of a new Congress. Sometimes it also dovetails with a new administration, like it does in this particular year. And it is a really excellent compilation and comprehensive resource of the roadmap that we hope members of Congress and their staff and the administration to some extent take to support wildlife and address the climate crisis and support environmental justice. It takes a lot of work to put it together, so it's not short, but it really should give you a good sense of how you can approach a member of Congress, no matter where they're on their political spectrum, and what you can encourage them to do, and how you would like to see them vote. So it's a great resource. We're going to drop that link in the chat so that you have it available, and it'll always be on our website for you to take a look at too. But in case you don't get enough of our brilliant work from this meeting today, you will have that available to you. But without further ado, we are going to make sure you hear from some of our most talented and most knowledgeable colleagues, in particular, our chief scientist, Diane Pataki, who I will hand it over to next. Diane?
Thanks so much, Abby. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. It's fantastic to be here with you. I'm Diane Pataki. I'm a scientist, and I'm a senior science advisor for the Action Fund. I work with a whole team of scientists at the National Wildlife Federation. And the National Wildlife Federation has always been science-based. Way back to its beginnings in the 1930s, it was founded to support wildlife recovery and conservation based on the best science. And we've made a lot of progress. We have really had a lot of wins in the environmental field and in conservation based on science. So we're going to pass along a link to a blog post that the science team shared in order to really just remind us that, you know, we've made a lot of progress. I know we forget that when it seems like there's a lot of work left to do, but the fight has changed. So we're in a different situation with some direct attacks on the basic science. That's the foundation of everything that we do in conservation and the environment. And we have, you know, the dismissal of federal scientists happening. One thing that we don't talk about enough, and now is the time to share these talking points and these stories, is that the conservation work that we do is done by people and by the people that work for the federal government. So even though we've had a lot of great wins, getting species off the endangered species list, we still have species that are conservation dependent. So we usually don't eliminate all of the threats to species once they're delisted. We haven't solved climate change yet. We still have pollution. We still have habitat loss. So people in the federal government are out there every day supporting the species that we care about. Scientists are out there tagging species. They're collecting data. We have to release species back into the wild sometimes. And without those people, we're going to lose those species. So we really, really need to support those federal scientists. And we're also losing the data that those scientists collected. The data sets that sit on public websites in the federal government, you purchase those data. You know, scientists have collected a ton of data paid for by taxpayers, and you own those data. So we have to make sure it stays open to the public. That includes climate data. It includes environmental data, data on environmental justice. There's just a huge treasure trove of resources that we're losing, and we're going to fight to keep those resources in the public domain. And finally, our other cuts to grant funding, that's jeopardizing the work of scientists in other organizations. So a lot of science is done by other scientists who are they're at universities or research labs, or they're at conservation organizations. And those grants are being cut, and they're being cut with this plan to shift that science to the private sector. But we know in conservation that that's not going to work. So the whole conservation movement was founded because we realized that we can't make wildlife private. Wildlife is not private property. Wildlife belongs to everybody. And that's why it's the responsibility of the government, of government scientists and federal agencies, to make sure that wildlife stays healthy, that our populations are recovering, that we don't lose species to extinction. So we're going to need everybody to help join this fight. You know, everyone's a scientist. If you're collecting information, you're contributing to new knowledge, you're a scientist, even if your title is not scientist. But not everybody identifies as a scientist. And what we should be doing is further democratizing the movement to make science open to everyone and to bring lots and lots of people into the scientific enterprise. What's happening now is the opposite. So you can really help us speak out for science, speak out for your own role in science. If you collect iNaturalist data on your phone, if you use apps that collect data on birds and plants and wildlife, you're contributing science to the public too. So you can help tell the stories of how science is absolutely critical for everything that we do. And we are going to win this fight. I mean, science is so fundamental to what makes America America. It's been the foundation of our economic prosperity. Why has the United States been the leader in innovation for decades? Because of public investment in science. And those innovations support the environmental work that we all care about. We're not done. We've made a lot of progress, but we have new breakthroughs that are coming out all the time to further advance wildlife recovery, environmental protection, clean air, clean water. So we are going to win this fight. The faster we win it, the more we'll be able to protect the environment and the species that we care about. It matters how quickly we're able to do this because some changes are irreversible. When we lose species, that is more or less an irreversible loss. So we've got to make sure that we prevent things like extinctions. And I think that every single person that participates in this fight makes these wins happen faster. So every single one of you can help. And we are going to give you the tools to do that. We're going to give you talking points that you can share both with decision makers and people in elected office, but also with your friends and family. You know, just talking about why do we need science? Why do we need federal scientists? You know, should we be slashing millions and millions of dollars from federal budgets when actually for years the National Wildlife Federation was trying to grow those budgets? They weren't large enough before. And we just need more people to share information about why those resources are critically important. So we're going to give you some tools and some training about storytelling because how we talk about this narrative is massively, massively important. So I am 100% sure that we are going to win, but we do need you. And we need you to participate in a lot of different ways that my colleagues are going to share with you. So I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague, Jill Feldhusen, and she's going to talk about our national parks and a topic that you may not hear about as often, but are so critically important, and that is our national wildlife refuges. Handing it to you, Jill.
Great. Thank you, Diane. And thank you to everyone who joined us and took time out of your day to be on this call. My name is Jill Feldhusen, and I have the privilege of working on wildlife policy at the National Wildlife Federation. And like Diane said, I get to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is public lands, very specifically the National Wildlife Refuge System. I'm actually calling in today from Montana, a state that is really blessed with an incredible array of public lands, including 21 different national wildlife refuges, 2 iconic national parks, Yellowstone and Glacier, of course, and then just an array of other federally managed public lands. And these lands have really facilitated just my deep love for wildlife and conservation and have spurred my passion for this work. And some of my favorite memories have been made on them. So happy to talk to you today. And I think in my next slide, I made a little plug for one of the best refuges in Montana, out in eastern Montana. If you're ever visiting, one of the few places where you can spend an hour and see bald eagles, pronghorn, elk, and it really feels like you've taken a step back in time. So that is the magic of the refuge system. And so I did just want to start also just with a high level overview of what wildlife refuges are. The National Wildlife Refuge System is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it really is our nation's largest network of lands and waters dedicated to wildlife conservation. And that is what makes the refuge system unique. We have public lands that serve, a variety of purposes, but the refuge system really is for wildlife. And I think in this moment where we know wildlife are facing so many challenges and whereas in sort of a biodiversity crisis, these lands are more critical than ever. The first wildlife refuge was designated back in 1903 by then President Theodore Roosevelt, and it was to protect some of the only remaining nesting habitat for brown pelicans. And of course, since then, the refuge system has exploded in a good way. There are now more than 570 wildlife refuges across the country, 38 wetland districts, and 5 marine national monuments. It truly covers millions of acres and a variety of habitats, everything from wetlands, coastal areas, forests, prairies, tundra, deserts, ocean. It really is just an incredibly large and diverse network of conservation lands, not only in the US, but it is pretty unique to the world as well. It's something we should be very proud of. Fish and wildlife obviously really depend on refuges and the habitat they provide. And this also, includes hundreds of species that are federally listed as threatened and endangered under the Endangered Species Act. So we know refuges are good for wildlife, but I also just really want to make a point that refuges are good for people. Not every state is like Montana and has, national parks and all of these other public lands that they can boast, but there is at least one wildlife refuge in every state and territory across the country. And a fact that I have recently learned I'm excited about is that there are 101 urban national wildlife refuges within 25 miles of most major metropolitan areas in the United States. And of course, there are also refuges in rural areas, and they just offer incredible access for hunting, fishing, the outdoors, whatever activity it is that you do. Refuges are a great place to take part in that. And I think at this moment where people are more and more disconnected from nature, these lands really are good for all of our well-being. So that said, despite their popularity and importance, the wildlife refuge system has just been incredibly underfunded for the last decade. And I don't want to bore you all with a year-by-year breakdown of federal appropriations, but I do just want to highlight a couple of numbers for you all. And that is in 2010, the refuge system received about $500 million in funding to support its program work, its staff, and operations. And in this year, in 2025, the refuge system received just about $527 million. To keep pace with inflation, the system should be receiving closer to $730 million just to maintain operations and programs. And this stagnant funding has really taken a toll on the refuge system over the last 15 years. And I do just want to highlight a couple of other points. Since 2011, refuges have lost 30% of their staff, which pencils out to about 800 permanent full-time positions. At this point, not a single wildlife refuge is fully staffed, and a lot of refuges, almost half at this point, have close to zero full-time professional staff. And this lack of funding has really made it hard for refuge managers to maintain and provide the programs that they do. And it has also created an infrastructure maintenance backlog that at this point is over $2 billion. So that's where we were heading into this Congress. It wasn't a great rosy picture, and things certainly haven't gotten better over the last several months. Since January, the refuge system has lost another over 200 full-time professional staff, and we are anticipating and bracing for potentially another 10% cut in their workforce to be in place by the end of the spring, as soon as early May, actually. So these cuts are really devastating. We are losing people who are, in all levels of the Fish and Wildlife Service, from the leadership down to the biologists who are doing surveys on endangered species. And we are just hearing more and more stories of how volunteers are now the ones that have keys to the education centers on our refuges. And it's truly a pretty unsustainable status quo that we are in. But that is a pretty gloomy picture. But I do just also want to say, I think that in this moment, we are seeing a renewed interest on wildlife refuges with members of Congress in a bipartisan way. I think never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think in this moment, we are getting good attention on this issue. And at the National Wildlife Federation, despite the odds, we are going to be working really, really hard with our partners to ask Congress to fund the refuge system at least $700 million to keep pace with inflation. And at the very least, we want to make sure that we are sharing information and spreading noise about the refuge system to make sure it is not facing deeper cuts in the upcoming conversations about government funding. And so we are going to need all of your help in sharing that message and spreading that. And I look forward to working with you all on this very important issue. And I'm sure I have used most of my time. So I will now toss this to my wonderful colleague, Jessica, to talk about climate.
Thank you so much, Jill. Hi, everyone. It's so great to be with you. My name is Jessica Arians. I'm an advisor for climate and energy policy at the National Wildlife Federation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing to fight for clean energy, another really important tool in our toolbox to protect wildlife and protect ourselves. So I want to start with a poll to try and get your brains cranking in the energy space. I don't know, Sam, if you can pull that up. Curious if folks have any thoughts. What percentage of electricity in the US is generated by renewables? So solar, wind, geothermal. And I'll give it a minute for folks to respond and see if you can guess what percentage of our electricity comes from clean renewable energy. And hopefully this is not too triggering for bringing you back to like high school pop quiz days, but just to get us thinking about the potential for renewables and clean energy in the US. I'm glad someone laughed at my joke. Thanks for that response. All right, maybe I'll give it 10 more seconds, Sam, and then we can close the poll and move on. But it may, yeah. So what percentage of electricity, and then in the US is generated by renewables? You can only choose one. I will give you a hint, it's not 100%, maybe one day, but certainly not now. We are not anywhere close to that. And maybe while we wait for the poll responses, I want to, so I think building off of kind of what my colleagues Diane and Jill shared, just like we've seen cuts in the elimination of programs at staff at scientific agencies across the US and for our national refuges, we've seen recently federal funding for clean energy projects being canceled or frozen, and this comes at I'm not seeing the poll results, Sam. I might have clicked out of it. So I was just gonna power through, but if we can share the poll results, that would be great, because I am curious what folks think. But in the interest of time, I was gonna keep on talking. But the answer, maybe while we wait, all right, what percentage? Well, I'm seeing an incorrect response. The correct response, sorry folks, is about 24%. So about 24% of electricity in the US is generated from renewable energy. That has been growing year over year. It continues to grow. And I think just shows the potential for renewables in the US, the growth we've seen, the growth that we at NWF are going to keep fighting for, because we know that clean energy is a really, really important part of how we protect wildlife and protect ourselves. And like I was mentioning, 61% of folks got it right. Thanks, Sam, and good for everybody for getting that so well. So like I mentioned, we've seen recently the freezing or canceling of federal funding for clean energy projects. And this comes at a time when our country's energy grid is already strained, when we've seen rising household energy prices, and when we've seen climate-fueled unnatural disasters driven by the use of fossil fuels increasing and getting worse. And now is really the time, as Diane touched on, for our leaders to really recommit to prioritizing clean air, clean water, and the health of communities and wildlife. And investing in clean energy is really one of the most powerful ways to do just that. So back in 2022, Congress passed legislation called the Inflation Reduction Act. You may have heard of it, also called IRA. And it made these investments. The bill funded conservation, environmental justice, resilience, and also included billions for climate and clean energy. And it's the most our country has ever invested in these areas. And it has helped businesses manufacture green technologies like solar panels and car batteries, capture and sequester carbon dioxide from the air and from factories, And for individuals, this bill provided tax credits and rebates that maybe some of y'all have taken advantage of to purchase rooftop solar or EVs or energy efficient heat pumps. I think two important things that I want to highlight in this bill, it also included extra incentives for energy communities to help steer clean energy investment into places where energy production was already an important industry or where local economies were struggling, which has been a really important tool in helping rural and energy dependent areas across the US. And it gives added benefit for projects that source domestic content and have high labor standards, which gives companies an extra reason to support American supply chains and create well-paying local jobs and communities. From clean steel in Middletown, Ohio, to solar and energy storage in Nevada's El Dorado Valley, to wind energy in upstate New York, these investments have paid off for our economy and for the climate. And you can see here in the climate space, the clean energy investments in IRA were projected to slash carbon emissions, which are the main driver of climate change in the US, by up to 48% by 2035. That's good for these adorable little sagebrush sparrows and many other species and humans as well. And over the last few years, thanks to these investments, we've also seen the biggest boom in American manufacturing in decades, nearly $290 billion invested in clean energy and manufacturing projects, with the creation of more than 400,000 jobs. So Sam, if you can go to the next slide, it shows a map from our partners at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, and it just shows the breadth of these investments. So all the purple dots you see there represent actual manufacturing, utility, electricity, or industrial projects, representing that nearly $290 billion in investment. They touch all of the US, not Alaska and Hawaii, not pictured, but they're definitely there. And these clean energy investments are currently at risk, however, of being eliminated by Congress. So the red dots are places where projects are announced, but yet to be started. So that's $524 billion investment. Those are now at risk. We know that taking away clean energy means less competition, fewer choices, and higher energy costs for American consumers. Recent studies have shown that, repealing these federal clean energy investments in the Inflation Reduction Act will increase residential electricity bills, hundreds of dollars per month over the next decade, cost thousands and thousands of jobs. And it's also going to increase climate altering pollution, the kind that fuels the destructive extreme heat and hurricanes we've seen, that worsens air quality. Repealing these investments is actually akin to adding 116 million more cars to a road by 2035. And the repeal will obviously leave us more dependent on outdated and harmful fossil fuels. So our policy team is working to protect these critical investments and really to help educate Congress about the economic, environmental, and public health benefits they provide. And we could absolutely use your help. So in the chat, I think my colleagues are going to drop two links. One is a link to an action alert that will let you send a message to your member of Congress, helping advocate for federal clean energy investments. And we're also sharing a link to a toolkit with lots more detail on these investments and why they matter and what's at stake. And I look forward to talking more and answering questions about all of this. Thanks again for the time. And I want to now turn it to our next speaker, Mike, with the Georgia Wildlife Federation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Worley. I'm President and CEO of the Georgia Wildlife Federation. It's great to be here with you this evening, and I'm really excited about this conversation. We're here tonight to talk about standing up for wildlife. What can we do? How can we make a difference? I'm looking here, we've got something like 265 participants on this call. Or on this webinar, how can we make a difference? I come from a different perspective, as you might imagine. You've heard everybody talking about things that you can do at the national level. I'm going to give you some examples of what goes on here at the state level and some of the ways that you can plug in, you can help, and you can make an impact in your local area, your community, your state. So I've chosen tonight to talk about our state wildlife action plans, and I hope everybody is familiar with those. If not, I'm going to give you a quick primer. So state wildlife action plans were something that were required from Congress about 20 years ago. By putting together these plans where states look at their wildlife and their wildlife status across their state, and developing a plan for how we can protect some of these wildlife issues and prevent some of them from going into things like the Endangered Species Act. And so we began these plans, and by doing these plans, our states qualify for something called a states and tribal wildlife grants, so that they can get some funding from Congress. It isn't huge funding, but it makes a big difference for for this implementation of these plans. So let me talk a little bit about Georgia as an example. So in 2000, about 2004 and 2005, we developed our very first plan here in Georgia. And a lot of states were struggling with how do you do this? What do you do? Georgia really took a chance and included all kinds of plants. We define wildlife very broadly here. If it we include plants, we include all of your mammals, but we also include uh, our invertebrates, and we include our fish, and we include all of the animals that we hunt and fish for, and also, more importantly, the animals that we don't hunt and fish for. And so that was the foundation of our plan. It worked along, clocked along for 10 years, and then every 10 years, you're required to do an update on the plan to continue getting the grant funding from the federal government. So we did an update in 2014 and implemented it in 2015. So the example I'm going to give you today is from that plan. We are currently in the middle of doing our third State Wildlife Action Plan, or SWAP. And I'm really proud about that. And I'll give you some quick statistics about it. Currently, our plan 10 years ago had about 640 animals, and it had our members species on it. And this is an effort to try and prevent these species of something called the species of greatest conservation need from going on the endangered species list. And so the picture you see here, and who doesn't love the picture of a gopher tortoise? I mean, really. And so the gopher tortoise is one of our iconic species here in the state of Georgia, and also identified as one of our species of greatest conservation need. You'll see on the right of your screen a picture of our one of our iconic native ecosystems. That's called a longleaf pine savanna. Longleaf pine obviously is the tree that you see here, but why is a man with a gun? But you see a tree, the tree's there, and the grass is is called wiregrass. But what you see here is a vision of a savanna. While the longleaf pine is what we name this for, it's really a grassland ecosystem, and it has. If you'll take a look at it, if you work in there, about 40 species can be in 1 square meter. About 300 different species of animals and plants live in an acre of this longleaf pine savanna. So the gopher tortoise is one of the residents of that, and it's called a keystone species. The gopher tortoise is, they dig about a 30-foot long burrow. They are critical. About 360 different species in that community depend upon the gopher tortoise for one portion or another of their life cycle. So the gopher tortoise is a wonderful little creature. This looks like he's scratching off and starting a big race. That actually is the gopher tortoise in the process of creating their burrow and creating the apron in front of it. So let's share the next slide. You'll see that's a gopher tortoise burrow. I always talk about them looking like hobbit holes. They're a wonderful place for these little animals. And this is an eastern indigo snake, one of our endangered species here in the state of Georgia. The eastern indigo is North America's longest snake. They came from evolved and came up from the tropics. So they are very cold sensitive, even in Georgia's climate. So the eastern indigo snake depends upon the gopher tortoise burrow, along with 359 other species for that their survival. So this is a critical component, and this, as I said earlier, the gopher tortoise is considered a keystone species, but it was in trouble here in Georgia with development, habitat fragmentation, habitat loss, and so because of our last state wildlife action plan, which I think of as a strategic plan. If coming from a business background, that would be the way we would decide how we focused our efforts and put our energies forward. The state wildlife action plan identified the gopher tortoise as a species of greatest conservation need, and its range is across the entire third of Georgia. And so there was a lot of concern that it could shut down if it were declared to be threatened or endangered. It could be considered a real impediment to economic development, growth of communities, and where people live and breathe and make their livings. So what did we do? If you'll go to the next slide, please. We created something called the Gopher Tortoise Initiative, and it involved the business community. It involved the conservation community like us at Georgia Wildlife Federation. And from the Piedmont fall line here in Georgia, south to the state line with Florida and to the coast of the Atlantic Ocean is all the Gopher Tortoise range. We put together a plan with all of those stakeholders to develop 65 different refuge areas, different types of refuges. And you can see on that screen a list of all the types of refuge areas for them. We have created those refuges. We created 64 of them. There was a 65th that we will have that will complete our 100% of our goal by June of this year. So by consciously identifying and developing a plan under our state wildlife action plan, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service this year, or in 2024, determined that the gopher tortoise did not require listing under the Endangered Species Act east of the Chattahoochee River, which forms the western boundary of Georgia. So our population, and the population in Florida, because we were proactive in addressing the needs of those animals, were able to prevent that listing. It's a huge success story, one that will continue to resonate through those communities in that area and with that population and with those 360 species that depend upon the gopher tortoise. So one of the things I would encourage you to do is work with your local agency. We are currently going through plans for our state wildlife action plan. It's up for public comment and public involvement. And I think one of the best comments I've heard from one of our agency folks that's leading that effort is that our state wildlife action plan isn't the Georgia Department of Natural Resources plan. It's actually a plan that belongs to all people of Georgia. Everyone can develop this plan, and everyone can work to ensure that our plants and animals are protected across the state. So encourage the folks around you, and I encourage you to get involved in your local community as well as at the national level. So I'm going to turn it over now to Abby, and I believe that we are going to go into a question and answer time. So thanks, Abby, and thanks everyone for letting me be here.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to all our incredible speakers for the snapshot of the picture of so many of the things that we are working on. You know, if we had 5 hours of your time, which we would never ask for, we could have talked about some of the threats we're facing towards our public lands, both in funding, like Jill touched on, but even just the concept of whether or not they should persist in public hands. And what Mike was getting into with the state wildlife action plans dovetails so well with our longstanding work to pass Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which we hope you've heard about, and we can definitely follow up more on in future conversations. And I saw so many great suggestions and questions and thoughts in the chat about the importance of balancing the clean energy transition with wildlife habitat, and that is a very central part of the National Wildlife Federation's work in this space. So I was trying to track everything with both the speakers and the chat and the Q&A, and just really appreciate y'all's engagement. This was really wonderful. So what questions should I answer? Lucy, do you have any for me, or should I pick my favorite? I'll
Thank-
go back to one that I saw a couple of different ways in the chat. Jessica, if you don't mind, touching a little bit on how, especially the National Wildlife Federation, we are concerned with, and aware of, you know, the potential impacts for clean energy projects, just like oil and gas infrastructure and other large infrastructure on wildlife habitat and tribal lands and cultural resources. And curious if there's anything you want to share to address that particular point.
Yeah, thanks so much, Abby. It's such a great question and really an important part of the work that my team does, along with so many of the partners at the National Wildlife Federation, but also so many of our affiliates. Like we know clean energy is development, and that is going to impact lands, water, wildlife, people. And how do we do it responsibly? How do we balance the needs of wildlife and wildlife habitat with the needs we have to invest in clean energy, to make sure we're building more clean energy, getting off of fossil fuels, which we know are also incredibly harmful for wildlife. And so we do that in a lot of ways, working on like best practices for how you site energy, where you put energy, thinking about putting transmission lines or solar projects on degraded lands like brownfields and Superfund sites and starting there instead of, you know, building on prime wildlife habitat. We work a lot with our public lands colleagues to think about kind of best practices for public solar siting on our public lands. So there's a lot of really kind of wonky policy work that we do here, but I do really appreciate the question. And it's definitely one of the reasons why us as a wildlife federation are even working on clean energy, because we want to make sure we are that voice for wildlife when we're talking about where we're putting solar and wind or transmission or geothermal or all these other things. And it's really a high priority here. So I think, you know, someone put a question in the chat about protecting a particular owl species from a data center. I think engaging at the state level, engaging in your state wildlife action plans, as Mike wonderfully mentioned, is a great space to kind of think about protecting particular species in your state and making sure you're talking to your local elected officials about your concerns for wildlife and how you're balancing those with the needs for clean energy. So it's a great question and something we think a lot about at NWF.
And I'm sure glad you do. Mike, I know you have a ton of experience with that in your state too. Is there anything you want to add to Jessica's answer about how you've engaged in this process for specific projects in Georgia?
Yeah, it clearly is one of the things that we're concerned about. Georgia is the 7th fastest growing state in solar energy development in the country. We've been building solar, utility scale solar like crazy around here. And we're talking about solar installations that are 3,000-4,000 acres. So we're talking about solar installations that are as large as our wildlife management areas. And so one of the things that we are doing is working with the solar developer community to ensure that those developments in some ways take into account or take into their planning process how they can minimize negative impacts on our wildlife. Things like trying to plant native plants in the to control erosion and sedimentation, to do things like change the structures of your fences to allow animals to move underneath them. Lots of things like that. You can find a lot of our information at our Georgia Solar website. You can find it on our website as well, and all of our recommendations that we've made with the solar community. But it is the point I'm making here is that it's incredibly important that we make our renewable energies as efficient and as effective for our wildlife partners as it is for us. And we're pro on all of them, but we can be smart and do it well.
Really true, Mike. Thank you. Diane, if you're okay for me to call on you, I know the science team at NWF works really closely with our tribal partnerships team and to incorporate Indigenous knowledge. So I'm curious if you could help address Tim's question in the chat, which is talking about connections made with Indigenous people and tribes' role in a lot of our work.
Yes, it's a great question. So we have a tribal partnerships team at the National Wildlife Federation, and it's a growing program, a really important program. In the science team, we don't just approach our scientific issues from like an academic science perspective. We're also very interested in indigenous knowledges, native science, traditional ecological knowledge. So the science team works with the tribal partnerships team to consider many different forms of knowledge, including these traditional forms of knowledge, which are so valuable for everything that has to be done in the United States and in North America. So we value both. Actually, we also value a third form of knowledge, which is community science, like the local knowledge that individual communities have about how their local ecosystems work, what has to be done to support the environment, what has to be done to support local wildlife. That's also a very, very valuable source of knowledge, even if it's not, an academic or like a Western science way of understanding the environment. We consider all three forms of knowledge when we try and make decisions about conservation. We've got academic and Western science, indigenous knowledges, and community science. So that's how we approach conservation.
Thank you so much, Diane, and thank you again to our participants for that question. If I could call out one other thing that I saw in a couple of different places, it was really emphasizing the work that is needed to protect public lands from sell-off, which is a very, an issue that's emerging in a lot of different spaces right now. Just at the end of last week, the Senate considered a budget resolution where an amendment was actually put forward that would allow public lands to be sold off as part of, to balance the federal budget or to, move forward on the budget resolution part of the process. And that is a really important thing to combat. And we were actually really grateful to see that a bipartisan group of senators voted that down. But we very much know our work isn't over. So that is certainly something you'll hear more from us at National Wildlife Federation. But Jill, there was also a question sort of related to that about the partners that we work with on these issues, including National Wildlife Refuge Association. Would you be able to touch upon that?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that question. The National Wildlife Refuge Association is a core partner that we work with, and a lot of our affiliates, like the Georgia Wildlife Federation, also work with. And then NWF is also part of a coalition. It's called the Cooperative Alliance for Refuge Enhancement, or CARE Coalition. And it is a really broad coalition, and that's one of the reasons it's a powerful coalition. It includes groups like NWF. It is led by the National Wildlife Refuge Association. It includes other, Ducks Unlimited. It includes Defenders of Wildlife. It really encompasses organizations across the spectrum of issues and priorities. And we have all come together around the idea that our refuges need funding, and it is something we all agree on and we work together on to promote. And it's one of the reasons, we are finding more and more interest in bipartisan momentum on refuge funding, and something we also work with the Refuge Association and also with individual friends. I know a lot of refuges have friends groups that do projects. And so a lot of our affiliates also partner with friends groups to do volunteer projects. We are trying to think through ways about how can we draw more attention to the refuge crisis by pulling all of our groups together, getting members of Congress out in the field to really see what's going on. And so there's definitely a broad coalition, and one that we are very happy to be part of.
Thanks a ton, Jill. And that just really, reminds me, we didn't, of course, we jumped into kind of the substance of the work in this particular conversation. But for those of you who might be newer to working with National Wildlife Federation or our history, we were founded nearly 90 years ago as a big tent organization that wanted to cross across and bring in farmers and hunters and anglers and conservationists. And, now we've certainly grown to think about environmentalists across the country to work on these issues together. So it's something that I think is, even more applicable in this political moment now than ever. But the importance of working with a range of partners to get things done is exactly why I come to work here every day. Tara, if you're okay for me to hand over to you next, I think people probably want to know, what do we do with all this information and what can we do to help? So let me hand that over to you.
Yeah, that sounds great. Hi, everybody. I'm Tara, advisor for organizing and campaigns with the National Wildlife Federation Action Fund. Thank you so much for being here, for partnering with us, and for our amazing presenters, and to my colleagues behind the scenes who brought us together tonight. These are really challenging times. From the recent storms, like happening now and flooding in the South and the Midwest, to more frequent wildfires, extreme weather. We're seeing devastating impacts on our climate, our ecosystems, our wildlife. Across the country, inequality and political divisions make it feel like progress is slipping away, and that can feel overwhelming and like we're more divided than ever, but we're not. Not us, not here, because you're here, and that really means everything. Showing up, having empathy, listening, learning, staying engaged. Here we are on a Tuesday night. This is how we build power. This is how we protect what we love. This is how we make things better. And nature is a really great teacher. It teaches us resilience. Just as ecosystems thrive through interdependence, where trees share nutrients through their roots, our movements grow stronger when we unite. Like rivers that carve new paths through stone, or a flock of birds that takes turns leading. We're strongest when we come together and share the weight of the burden. So, what does that look like? Well, here are just a few ways that you can help make a difference. Number one, contact your elected officials and decision makers. We've talked about it before. We do it, it works. Decisions are being made right now in Congress, at the State House, in your local city council. All of these, that they impact wildlife, they impact our way of life, and your voice matters. So whether you're calling your member, emailing your rep, showing up at a town hall, you're reminding decision makers that they work for you, and sharing what you care about with them matters. And if you're not sure what to say or how to start, just head on over to our Action Center online. And you can find a lot of different ways that you can easily urge Congress to pass the Empowering the and Enforcing Environmental Justice Act, or the Bipartisan Recovering America's Wildlife Act. You can call on the administration to remove Lower Snake River dams to support salmon and uphold commitments to tribal nations. You can ask your governor to restore protections for wetlands, or encourage your mayor to help butterflies by taking our mayor's monarch pledge, and more. So every call, every letter, every moment you show up, it adds up. Number two, share your story. You don't need to be an expert. You just need to speak from the heart. What's your connection to the land? What's your connection to wildlife? What's happening in your community due to weakened protections or cuts to science? What are you seeing? What are your neighbors seeing? Sharing your story on social media, at town halls, or with your family and neighbors, you're helping people see what the real world impact is of the policy choices that are happening. And your voice can reach not just the policymakers, but your wider networks and create a ripple. And we're offering a storytelling training actually on May 7th to help you feel more confident sharing your voice. And we hope you'll join us and share your stories with us. Third, we invite you to use your civic power. Make sure you're registered to vote and participate in every election, from school board to Senate. There are important state and local elections this year, and critical federal races next year. And you should ask candidates what they'll do to protect the environment and your rights. Our democracy works when we participate, when we all participate. And we know that many communities, especially those in historically marginalized communities, they face compounded environmental and social challenges. And so that's why we're going to continue to fight for policies that prioritize equity and justice, so that everybody has the opportunity to thrive. And then fourth, stay connected. Locally and nationally, when our government falls short, we can turn to each other. Like communities after the Park Fire in California, or the Hurricane Helene in North Carolina, folks stepped up, offered shelter and food and supplies for their neighbors. Change often starts at a really personal level, and community can be a lifeline. And we're glad you're part of ours. In addition to the National Advocacy Center in DC, we partner with our sister organization, the National Wildlife Federation. Of course, we have the Action Fund. We have staff, regional offices, affiliate partners in 52 states and territories all over. So it shouldn't be hard to connect with us. Mike Worley in Georgia is one great example of affiliates who lead state and local efforts and collaborate with us across the country. And connect with us online, follow our social media accounts. The Action Fund is on Blue Sky, X, and Facebook. We've got upcoming events, email alerts, all kinds of good things. And then finally, celebrate our wins, grieve our losses, keep showing up. Last year, the Action Fund and our partners helped win big for wildlife, for clean water, for climate justice. Voters passed a $10 billion measure in California to fight wildfires and protect habitat. They renewed Minnesota's Environmental Trust Fund. They secured coastal restoration funding in Louisiana. And we defeated rollbacks in Washington state and defended science-based wildlife management in Colorado. There are wins. We're making things happen. So it's important to acknowledge that and celebrate and recognize the activists like you that help make that happen. And then pioneering environmentalist Wangari Maathai shared an inspiring story of the hummingbird that refused to stand by as a forest burned, which really inspires me. In the story, while the other animals watched helplessly, the tiny bird carried drops of water in its beak to fight the flames, back and forth, one drop at a time, saying, I'm doing the best I can. Each of us has the role to play. Let's just do the best we can, and it will contribute to something greater. And it's also important to recharge because we've been carrying a lot of water. So spend time in nature. That can be a great way to ground yourself and remind you of what you're fighting for. And we're in this for the long haul, and we will realize a better world together. And we're so grateful to have you along with us for everything you've done. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you all so much for being here. Look out for us for future events just like this, and don't hesitate to send questions in the meantime. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Have a wonderful night.